We've all heard about the Vought Corsair, right? A legendary fighter and attack aircraft, the Corsair carved its reputation in multiple campaigns of the Second World War and in the skies of several wars afterwards. And it is often listed with proper justifications as one of the greatest combat aircraft of all time. Which means that everyone and his dog has written about it, and so I very much doubt I can ever class it as a forgotten aircraft. Well, apart from the Goodyear built variants, but I have already covered those. But what is forgotten and overlooked are the first Vought Corsairs, the O2 and O3Us. And that is surprising because in their day they were hugely successful designs that saw masses of service. Vought had begun making aircraft for the US Navy all the way back in 1917, supplying VE-7 trainers and fighters. The company continued refining its designs, achieving what were for those lean post-war years good sales to the Navy. So when in 1925 that service required a new aircraft to serve in what today we would describe as a multi-role capacity, they turned to Vought. In 1926, Vought presented their answer, the O2U, which would soon be reclassified as the O2U-1 as the aircraft went through rapid development. After trialling two prototypes, the US Navy ordered an initial batch of 130 O2Us in 1927, which was soon supplemented by additional orders for the follow-on O2U-2 through 4, as well as a number for foreign export. Glorying under their new name of Corsair, the O2Us proved to be an excellent, capable and flexible aircraft that served as scouts, i.e. fighters, attack and observation aircraft. A single-bay, two-seat biplane with wings of almost equal span, the O2Us had the Pratt & Whitney Wasp engine that produced 450 horsepower and gave the first models a top speed of 151 miles per hour. Construction was of a metal framework with the fuselage skinned from the engine bay back to behind the pilot seat in metal alloy, whilst the rear fuselage and wings were fabric covered. Additionally, the undercarriage could either be twin wheels or switched out for floats, allowing the Corsair to serve on land, off carriers, or as the observer aircraft for battleships and cruisers. Armament in the O2Us was initially only a single Browning 30 caliber machine gun mounted in the top wing, a Lewis gun on a flexible mounting for the observer in the rear, and a payload of 4 116-pound or 10 30-pound bombs under the lower wings. And the O2s were thrown into combat in extremely short order. Despite only being ordered in 1927, by January 1928, one of the very first of the type in service was showing not just the capabilities of the O2U, but giving a demonstration of an element of air power capability that today we take for granted, but which was then revolutionary. The US Marine Corps had deployed in the Central American country of Nicaragua in 1926, where they quickly became embroiled in an increasingly bitter fight with revolutionaries led by August Sandino, one of the many so-called Banana Wars. The Marine Air Corps would famously go on to be an early demonstrator of the use of direct air support for ground forces in Nicaragua, with their use of what we now call Close Air Support, CAS for short, being instrumental in the Marines winning several engagements. Marine O2Us would prove very successful in this role, being used as dive bombers by the Marines against Nicaraguan forces, which created a fair amount of attention for this type of aerial attack and spurring further development in it around the world. But early 1928 saw the Marines use air power and the Corsair in another fresh innovation. On the 30th of December 1927, Sandino guerrillas ambushed a force of Marines in the town of Quilali, almost certainly pronounced that wrong, in mountainous northern Nicaragua. The Marines sustained several casualties and were essentially cut off from outside support. Things looked exceptionally grim. Except there was one flying leatherneck who, along with his O2U, thought differently. Flying into the middle of the firefight, First Lieutenant Christian F. Schilt was able to land his aircraft, one of the first delivered O2Us, directly into the middle of the besieged Marines. Between the 6th and 8th of January, he flew into the middle of the town under heavy fire a total of 10 times, flights with which he was able to deliver 1,400 pounds of critical medical supplies, a new commanding officer, and evacuate 18 wounded Marines to safety. Considering that his aircraft was about 32 feet wide and his landing zone was only 100 feet in width, all with Sandino troops shooting at him, that required some pretty cool flying. Somewhat understandably, Schilt received the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions. When you think about it, this demonstration was effectively a foreshadowing of a major role that US Marine Corps air power conducts today. While much is remembered of the lessons the USMC learnt in the use of close air support during what is known as their small war period, the use of air power to supply and fly in and out personnel in contact is a prime factor in the today's Marine Corps, as well as modern militaries generally. But to return to the Corsair, the new aircraft was obviously a great improvement on the aging World War I era aircraft that formed much of the US Navy's air fleet, and so the aircraft was subject to several follow-on orders in 1928. First was the O2U-2, which featured larger wings and tail. This was followed by the 3, which had revised rigging on the wings and improved tail, and then the 4, which had some further equipment changes. These aircraft also had different models of the Wasp engine, as that too was worked on and improved, and in total 379 production aircraft were built, mainly serving with the US fleet, where they were nicknamed the Eyes of the Navy, and with the Marines, but also with a fair number of Corsairs going to export customers. The ongoing success of the Corsair and the rapid pace of improving technologies, especially in engines, meant that in 1930, Vought developed a new model, the O3U, at the request of the Navy. The first of these, the O3U-1s, were equipped with Grumman floats, which featured retractable wheels to give the aircraft amphibious capability, and the 87 built served as the primary observation aircraft for the US Navy's cruisers and battleships. They were followed in short order by the O3U-2s, which had modifications made to the airframes to take the larger and more powerful Pratt & Whitney Hornet engine. The O3U-2s were soon largely redesignated as the SU-1 and were considered two-seat fighters, being transferred to the Marines. The SU-1s were followed by the O3U-3s, which once again were for naval use, primarily as spotters, but were fitted with the more powerful Pratt & Whitney Wasp-12, which produced 550 horsepower, and then by the O3-4s. Fitted with Hornet engines producing 700 horsepower, these were given to the Marines once again as fighters, designated as the SU-2 and 3, the latter of which had low-pressure tyres for rough field operations. The final US examples were the single XO3U-5, which had a twin Wasp Junior engine, and the ultimate variant, the O3U-6, which reverted to the Wasp but had a NACA cowling and enclosed cockpit. All of this evolution of the Corsair took place essentially over a 10-year period, with the production line in the US closing in 1937, and up until 1939 it was the standard US Navy observation aircraft. Despite rapidly being replaced by a more advanced aircraft after this date, over 140 Corsairs were still in service when the US entered the Second World War in December 1941. Even after being replaced, they continued to see use, conducting patrols with the US Coast Guard and serving as trainers until 1945. However, it isn't just their considerable usage with the United States military for which the Corsair should alone be remembered. Because, like its more famous descendant, the Corsairs saw a massive action with other nations as well, with the flexibility of the basic design allowing Vought to fit improved engines, armament and capabilities into the aircraft, tailoring it to individual specifications. As a result, the Corsair was exported to Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Mexico, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, China and Thailand. Evaluation examples were even purchased by the British, the Japanese, and Germany, and all these custom orders meant that there were a myriad of different designations and specs for the Corsair. And as the 1920s and 30s were turbulent times, these aircraft were often in the thick of the action. In South America, they were used by Peru against anti-government guerrillas before being used to attack Colombian forces and warships during the short war fought between the two countries in 1932-33. In Mexico, the urgent delivery of 1202 Corsairs in 1929 was critical in revitalizing the Mexican Air Force and in putting down a major rebellion by General Jose González Escobar, which represented a severe threat to the central government. So impressed were the Mexicans that they obtained a production license, and the Corsair proved an important type in the expanding Mexican Air Force. In 1938, Mexican Corsairs, this time the much improved V-99M export model, were used to help quell another rebellion, and there are unconfirmed reports that some of these aircraft were subsequently shipped to Spain for use by Republican forces fighting in the Civil War there. One of the most prolific military users of the aircraft was China, who purchased 63 export variants of both the O2 and the O3. These reputedly first saw use against the Japanese in 1932 during the January 28th incident, and then again from 1937 onwards when the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out. Though I suspect honestly that they didn't last long considering their age and the capabilities of the opposing Japanese aircraft and air forces. The final foreign customer to use their Corsairs in combat was Thailand. And with the Thais, the Corsairs saw action in a little-known conflict with France, of all countries. The fall of France in 1940 meant that that country's colonial possessions in Indochina were now essentially no longer protected by the might of the French Empire. And so the Thais sought to capitalise on this and to redress old wrongs committed on them by taking back territories they had been forced to cede to France in the past. This conflict, the Franco-Thai War, was waged between October 1940 and January 1941 and saw a considerable amount of air power used by both sides in supporting their respective ground and naval forces, as well as bombing each other's military facilities. And the most common type in use was the Vought V-93S, with around 70 of these aircraft flying with the Royal Thai Air Force, making up around half their active strength. The V-93S was an export variant of the O3U-6, which the Thais also built under license at their own factory, where they replaced the indigenous Boripatra in production, and which probably represented the peak of the type in service. Equipped with a Hornet engine that produced 675 horsepower, the V-93S also had an armament of initially 2, then increased to 4 8mm machine guns, 1 in each wing, plus the standard single Lewis gun for the observer, and the wing-mounted bombs. Naturally, the V-93 saw considerable usage in the war with French Indochina, proving once again to be very competent dive bombers, but also being credited with achieving the first air-to-air kill for the Thai Air Force. In November 1940, a Corsair and 2 Curtiss Hawk 3s intercepted a French bomber escorted by 6 Morane-Solier MS-406 fighters. Despite the disparity in numbers and capabilities, one of the 406s was credited as shot down during the ensuing battle, with that credit generally being attributed to the Corsair. Despite losses to their numbers in this conflict, as well as more that followed in the later Japanese invasion, and then from Allied bombing throughout the rest of the Second World War, Corsairs went on to serve until 1950 with the Thais. As a result, we now have a single original example of this, the first model of Corsair, lovingly maintained at the Royal Thai Air Force Museum in Bangkok, which I believe is the sole survivor of the 580 Corsair 1s built, as well as also, from what I understand, being the oldest surviving example of a Vought aircraft anywhere. As a final note on their long service, I also feel I should clarify one important engagement that the Vought Corsair did not take part in. O3Us are often credited for being the aircraft used in the epic battle with a certain giant ape over the Empire State Building in 1933's King Kong. But they are not. In fact, the live action shots were Stearman C3s, while the models used in the battle shots are more like Curtiss Falcons. However, though the Vought Corsair was not responsible for dispatching the furry menace, that doesn't detract from the record of what was a remarkable aircraft with a remarkable service history. An aircraft, moreover, that was an important stepping stone for the developments that aeronautic and aero-engineer design were taking in the 15 years prior to the start of World War II. Plus, by demonstrating the potential of air power, not just in aerial combat, but also in assisting ground forces, both with close air support and logistic and personnel transport directly into the hottest parts of the combat zone. The Corsair really was a pioneer in showing the flexibility that air power would bring to future warfare.